All right, we're live. Okay. Good morning, friends, colleagues. Please introduce me. My name is Rafitrandi. I'm a researcher from Center for Strategic and International Studies Indonesia, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. Thank you very much for joining with us today at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Indonesia and Korea Foundation webinar. In today's webinar, we will discuss the nexus of state, economy, and democratization in two countries, which are Indonesia and South Korea. Of course, I'm not an expert of this topic, but I remember a couple of weeks ago, I read an article in The Economist. I think it's regarding the global democratic recession. It explains that the threat to our democratization is not really come from the military coups, but a government in power. I think this is very interesting. It also showed that the last year's democracy index happened to be the worst ever. And moreover, the COVID-19 has contributed to accelerated the decline. More specifically, in today's webinar, we will observe two countries, Indonesia and South Korea, two democratic and middle power countries, I think with a 2 days apart of its Independence Day, if I'm not mistaken, which I argue have been took on quite a different path of in both politics and also economy, which of course leading to different dynamics and outcomes. So I think the topic that we will discuss today is very timely and relevant. And I'm honored that our four distinguished panelists who will discuss this topic for the next few hours already here with us. We have two panelists from Ewha Women's University, South Korea, Professor Brendan Howe and Professor Hanah Jan, both from the Graduate School of International Studies. The other two are our own Executive Director, Dr. Phillips Vermonte, and our own researcher, Mr. Edbert Gani from CSIS Indonesia. Some housekeeping rules. Feel free to use the chat feature if you have any questions, and we will have the question and answer session after the panel. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Phillips Vermonte, the Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, to open the session. Dr. Vermonte, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dandi, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. And it's good to see Brendan. It's been quite a long time since our meeting in Seoul, and I think this pandemic certainly put a stress on us on how to move forward with this project. And finally, I think we are happy to have this. But we regret that we could not host you in Indonesia or in Jogja as we planned. And so we cannot reciprocate your hospitality when you and Professor Hanah Jan hosted us in Seoul for the first workshop of this project. And to the audience, I just want to start with, Dandi, this is not the presentation, right? This is just the introductory remark.
That's correct, yep.
All right, okay. This is a project that we initiated because at one point, CSIS, especially under the leadership of Dr. Vidyandika Perkasa and the Department of Politics and Social Change in Indonesia, at one point we discussed South Korea. And then we are kind of amazed how South Korea has advanced so much in terms of economy, in terms of democratic development, and so many aspects, coupled with that, technology and so on and so forth. And we remember that Indonesia and South Korea at one point in history as well, we were on the same league, late 60s and early 70s. And at one point, we were dubbed by some agencies, World Bank and ADB and so on, as the East Asia miracles and so on and so forth. In followed 10 years later in 1998. But then we've seen that our path diverged, in terms of per capita income. South Korea is now more higher than Indonesia, of course, and probably more higher than many of countries in Asia, in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And in terms of technology, and how South Korea has transformed itself into a solid middle power, so to speak, while Indonesia since 1998 we've been struggling with our democratization processes, and as Dandi mentioned earlier, the indexes are not favorable to to Indonesia in terms of how we have advanced our democracy. We seems to be in a perpetual mode of transition. So Vidya and team was thinking about how we can learn from South Korea, because we started, more or less from a kind of a same level. So that's why at that time we had a good connection with the Korea Foundation, and they agreed to help us doing the study. And we found Professor Brendan Howe of the Women's University, who agreed as well to collaborate with us. Thank you for the collaboration. And then I think if there is a representative of Korea Foundation attending this webinar today, thank you very much. So we are hoping that this collaborative research then will be transformed into some sort of publication. And Dr. Brendan Howe has been working on that particular aspect, because he has a more connection than us. And I think that what this research is all about, collaborative research and then joint publication. So I hope this webinar will be of crucial importance for our future cooperation between CSIS and Women's University in Seoul. Back to you, Dandi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vermonte. So we will go to our first panelist. I want to introduce Professor Brendan Howe. Professor Howe is professor of International Relations and former Associate Dean and Department Chair of the Graduate School in International Studies, Ewha Women's University, South Korea. He is also currently the president of the Asian Political and International Studies Association and an honorary ambassador of public diplomacy and advisor for the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Professor Howe, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dandi. And actually the APISA logo is what's appearing behind me at the moment. I don't know if everyone can see that, but we do encourage all of the audience members to join APISA. It's free at the moment to join, well, at least to friend us on Facebook. And then you'll get announcements about things like this webinar and also other conferences and publications. I, of course, also would like to thank the hosts, CSIS Indonesia, for bringing me onto this project. It's been great fun, and I look forward to future cooperation, and of course to the Korea Foundation for supporting this initiative. So a lot of what I wanted to talk about maybe has already been alluded to by our, okay, let me see. It might be better if I share my screen, I think, can I? Can you allow me to share my screen, then I can, yeah, okay, that's gonna be better. And okay, there we go. Now I can go through it myself. So a lot of what my first slide here refers to has already been addressed with the introduction, that first of all, the unprecedented challenges to Western conceptualizations of liberal democracy, so much so that Putin in Russia said essentially Western liberal democracy is dead. As such, it's important to consider what alternative sources of optimism there are for continuation of the democratic project, but also the challenges that may be faced in non-Western countries in terms of continuing the democratic project. As with many other governance initiatives, both domestic and international, the Asia-Pacific region is often, and indeed is increasingly, viewed as an alternative source of theoretical and practical gravity when it comes to promoting democracy or other forms of governance. But while this region may hold out significant hope for the furtherance of the democratic project, indeed it's been defined by several of the indices as the region most likely to progress democracy, it's likely to be reflected in different models and modalities of governance than are traditionally embedded in Western liberal individualism as a source of democracy. Asia's models of governance, I think, can be characterized by two distinguishing and salient sets of characteristics. First, the nature of political culture and social constructs, which I think are mostly going to be addressed in tomorrow's webinar. And secondly, the importance of economic development. Different databases and measurements of democratization, as well as different considerations of power and influence, produce different lists of case studies that are the most salient in this region for us to study. But South Korea and Indonesia appear across all dimensions and measurements consistently to be amongst the most salient studies that we should study, that we should consider in looking at the impacts that the Asia Pacific can have in furthering the democratic project. I'm now going to talk exclusively about Korea to give a broad overview of the double transition in Korea that's already been alluded to. First of all, the miracles on the Han River, and I deliberately use miracles rather than miracle because of this double transition. The economic miracle, well, after the Korean War, the Republic of Korea was utterly devastated politically, economically, and socially. But unlike most that have fallen under the weight of such burden, Korea rose successfully and dramatically to transform itself into a modern industrialized country. Indeed, it's now a member of the 50-30 club with 50 million population or more and $30,000 per capita GDP. So the economic miracle on the Han River is broadly known, and that when people think about Korea, they think about this dramatic rise, this dramatic recovery from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being a member of the rich man's club. But the economic miracle on the Han River has also been matched by what some people have considered to be a similar political miracle on the Han River. First of all, with democratic transition, and then perhaps even more importantly, followed by democratic consolidation. Throughout the history of the Republic of Korea, the two most influential actors upon the democratization of governance have been the relationship between economic development and society and the dominance of society by the state. These factors also relate to ongoing challenges facing contemporary Korean democracy. Despite dramatic developmental success, there are ongoing concerns about the quality of life for many South Koreans that in turn can undermine perceptions of the desirability of democratic governance, or indeed the quality of that governance. Furthermore, the state, which plays such a commanding role in Korean economic and political development, has been substantially captured by the elites. So I'm going to look at this in a little more detail, but I think it's important if we're asking the question, what can Indonesia learn from the Korean experience? Well, you've got to take the bad as well as the good. There are some elements of the Korean experience that you may not want transferred to Indonesia. Importantly, elites in Korea are able to manipulate, manufacture, and challenge fear of external and internal threats, co-opting potentially progressive forces. So I will be addressing this securitization of fear for democratic governance. So starting with the state economy nexus, the developmental state, obviously under dictatorship, so not democratic, but led to a significant progress in aggregate well-being, with GDP per capita rising from $79 in 1960 to $5,500 in 1989. And these development growth patterns continued after democratic transition. 20,000 GDP per capita milestone was reached in 2007, and we're now significantly over 30,000. I think the latest figures around about 32,000 per capita. And a lot of this growth has actually had a positive effect on society. Korea prioritized human capacity building and education in order to facilitate this growth and match the stages of development with the stages of support for education. Education has also laid the foundations upon which democratic principles and institutions are based. Indeed, Korea has spent more on education than any other country, has the most literate and most highly educated workforce on the planet. It may be too educated now. We actually have, I think, about 80% in university educated, and we now have a top-heavy skill set in terms of employment in this country. Education, however, has also promoted political knowledge, changed political behavior patterns, and shaped political attitudes and values. Education has imbued the people with commitment to modernization, but also commitment to citizenship. Increased education opportunities have made upward social mobility possible, and the middle class has expanded fairly dramatically as a result. The macroeconomic models and measurements detailing the miracle of the Han River, however, do not take into account the distribution of economic well-being. It's all very well to talk about how miraculously and dramatically Korea has developed, but we need to look at the distribution of this economic well-being. Rapid economic development did indeed lift many out of poverty in the early decades, and indeed, early on, the economic benefits were relatively evenly or equitably distributed, but this began to change in the mid-1990s. And indeed, the major turning point was the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which had devastating consequences for the economy as a whole, but in particular for the livelihoods of the working population, with the most vulnerable bearing the brunt of the economic downturn. Since that point, South Korea's Gini coefficient has been steadily rising, meaning there's been an increase in inequality, certainly since the Asian financial crisis and the IMF-inspired reforms opening the Korean economy. The irregularly employed share of the total workforce has increased dramatically, and despite campaigning on a platform of reducing inequality, President Park Geun-hye did little to address institutional sources of widening inequality, and indeed, many measures during her administration actually exacerbated the problems. More recently, of course, we had the Moon Jae-in administration came to power promising a more human-centered governance perspective, but critics would argue that this is yet to be achieved. Housing prices indeed have spiraled beyond the reach of most of the populace now. There's been, I think, since Moon Jae-in came to power, in some areas there's been a 50% increase in housing prices, which is just not sustainable and just not affordable. Of course, there's also been a heavy toll exacted by the COVID-19 crisis, as well as trade disputes with Japan, the US, and China. So Korea is not doing such a good job of picking its fights. Since the euphoria of initial democratic transition, statistics show that an increasing number of Koreans question whether their country has truly become a better place within which to live. And we see substantial rises in alienation, dehumanization, public violence, crime, environmental pollution. And indeed, for many Koreans, we see something of an expectancy gap developing as democracy is proven unable to match what may be their inflated economic expectations. So let's look a little more detail at this miraculous democratization. Well, the first question is, when did Korea democratize? When was this sudden democratic transition? And there are competing theories about this, which shows why some still question the degree of democratization. During the period 1987 to 1988, the military dictatorship was indeed transformed and ultimately replaced by something akin to a democratic state, headed by the popularly elected No Tae-woo. But No's party, the Democratic Justice Party, was also that of his friend and mentor, the former dictator Chun Doo-hwan. The two key opposition leaders, Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung, were unable to overcome their differences and therefore split the anti-government vote. And we see this as an ongoing problem in Korean democracy, that the authoritarian core and elites holds fairly steady, and the opposition, only when they get their act together do they come into government. The 1992 election of the country's first civilian political leader in more than 3 decades, President Kim Young-sam, is often therefore seen as the true turning point. But again, 1997, we saw the election of Kim Dae-jung, and this is also heralded as the true dawn of democracy because Kim Young-sam was still tied to the old elites. So Kim Dae-jung is seen as the first true opposition candidate. But even Kim Dae-jung had an elite background. He was still educated amongst the top schools. He was still closely affiliated with the old ruling elites, even if he had a different political perspective. So some also therefore make a case for the election of President No Mu-yeon in 2002 as representing the true turning point when the political mold was broken. The new president marked a fundamental break with the past in that he did not belong to the old elite. In fact, had been persecuted by the old elite. Still others say it was only with return to the power of a conservative, Lee Myung-bak, in 2007, that Korea completed a cycle of plurocracy, and all the major factions, players, and individuals had a turn at governing. But the limitations on the participation of those who are governed and accountability of those who govern can still leave democracy unconsolidated in the fullest sense. And we see this with some of the institutional problems under the Park Geun-hye administration. During the 2012 election, a scandal erupted concerning the involvement of the National Intelligence Service in manipulating public opinion against opposition candidates and in favor of Park Geun-hye's candidacy. Once elected, with this scandal ongoing, Park Geun-hye then rolled back a lot of the liberal democratic freedoms in the country, including curbs on the press, freedom of speech, persecution of journalists and opposition parties, persecution of organization and assembly. Ultimately, a series of scandals brought the Park regime crashing down in a maelstrom of mass demonstrations of up to 1 million participants and lawsuits, which ended with conviction of both President Park and her conservative predecessor, Lee Myung-bak, as well as a number of their prominent supporters. So it could be argued that democratic consolidation could be seen as only finally secured with the election and overwhelmingly popular mandate of Moon Jae-in in 2017. Even then, it's by no means certain that South Korea can be considered a stable democracy. even if it is procedurally a consolidated one. Data from the Asian Barometer survey indicates a weakening of public support for democracy since the mid-1990s, lower levels of satisfaction with democracy in practice than most other Asian democracies, and a sharp erosion of public trust in representative institutions of democracy. So a bit of a mixed bag. This is why I'm saying that Indonesia needs to be very careful when looking at Korea, what elements you want to follow and what elements you might want to put on the back burner. The Republic of Korea is sometimes seen as a prime example of a Schumpeterian elite model of democracy. Elites have captured commanding heights of industry, governance, legislation, administration, prosecution, education, and communication. Elite domination and the corresponding disenfranchisement of other groups has grown in recent years, facilitated by what's called econophoria, the aspiration to solve all of society's problems through economic growth. Slavage adherence to neoliberal principles, and the policy making of successive conservative administrations. There's something of an aspirational Darwinian struggle in South Korea, where because of this upward mobility, everyone is striving to rise above the others. Vulnerable sections of society remain trapped, and what's being described as Hell Joseon is a reality for many, especially young Koreans, with 88% recently saying they hated their country and wanted to leave. Nevertheless, there are signs that Korea is also becoming an increasingly participatory and direct democracy. I think it's very important to look at how actively Korean citizens are engaged with discussions of democracy and participation in democracy. This is very different from many other Asian countries and is highlighted by the role of netizens and mass demonstrations championing the precepts of democracy and indeed demanding a better job being done by those who are elected in the democracy. Thank you, that'll do for me.
Thank you very much, Professor Howe. So we will go to our second panelist, which is Dr. Phillips Vermonte, the Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia. He will share his observation regarding Indonesia's democracy resilience and its challenges. Dr. Vermonte, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Dandi, and thank you, everyone, once again for attending this webinar. I do not prepare PowerPoint slides, but I do have some ideas, and it is written in the introduction part of the plan book that CSIS and Ewha Women's University in Seoul plan to publish pretty soon. Number one, I think we start with the question that I already raised during the introductory remark earlier, that it seems that Indonesia's democracy continues to face so many challenges from various fronts. It's been, we've seen ups and downs in the past 20 years of democratization processes. If we look at the various indexes published by international institutions, the state of democracy in Indonesia, seems to be experiencing, back and forth. Similar thing happened. I have to mention that at the global level, a similar thing happened. We see some backslidings, but at another point, we see that we move forward on a particular aspect of democracy. To give you one example of a few examples, World Value Surveys, WVS, during the period of 2000 and 2006, that means some 10 years of the early democratization period in Indonesia, World Value Survey found that Indonesia fell into the category of ineffective democracy. Another institution, Freedom House surveys, also indicated the progression and regression of Indonesia's democracy during the period of 2005 to 2013. For example, Freedom House praised Indonesia, rated Indonesia as a free country, but yet in 2014, Freedom House rated Indonesia as partially free country. The same is true according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, for example, that it recorded a downward trend of Indonesia's democracy. Last year in 2019 report, the Economist Intelligence Unit called Indonesia as a flawed democracy, which which is pretty sad for many observers of Indonesia as well as Indonesian citizens. And those who are working on democratization advocacy in Indonesia. Now, why is it that Indonesia has seemingly been trapped in the perpetual transition mode? That our consolidation of democracy has been a long, painful, difficult processes. I think a number of factors can be taken into account as this research team try to examine. Number one, I think the reason, reading all the chapters produced by CSIS researchers in this project, it is pretty clear that one of the reasons why it's been slow and painful processes is that we have no clean break from our authoritarian past. When Indonesia started the reform in 1998. The fall of the Suharto's regime that ruled the country for 32 years was not followed by the collapse of the structure that supported his presidency. Two main political pillars of the Suharto's New Order authoritarian rule remain intact, namely the party, the Golkar Party, and the Indonesian Armed Forces, TNI. Although, interestingly, these two state institutions have been trying so hard to reform themselves. And the Indonesian Armed Forces, for example, has been found to be one of the leading institutions that started the reform from within. But a number of factors can be attributed to explain why the Indonesian Armed Forces remain one institution that some people still suspect that it is actually hindered the democratization process. Human rights violation in the past has not been dealt with properly, and so on and so forth. Aside from this reason that we have no clean break from our authoritarian past, one of the researchers alluded to the fact that Indonesia continuously suffers from another structural problem inherited from the Suharto's authoritarian period. Namely, we have yet to be successful in curbing corruption, collusion, and nepotism practices that can affect how the economy works and how power relations are practiced among the elites, the relations between one political institutions to another, and so on and so forth, continue to be plagued by this corruption, collusion, nepotism practices. In fact, if we remember, these practices of corruption, collusion, and nepotism were contributing to the financial and economic crisis that hit Indonesia in 1997 and led to the downfall of Suharto's authoritarian presidency. So sadly, this practice continue to plug in the Indonesian society and in the Indonesian political system. And as a result, up until today, these practices continue to affect businesses and development, the result of which is the high cost and inefficient economy and inefficient development. Pandemic, which is not the subject of this research, probably exacerbated this, this situation. Those who are observing Indonesian politics might know very well how already 2 ministers were caught by the Indonesian Anti-Corruption Commission because of their corrupt practices during the pandemic time. Now, in this regard, as one of the researchers wrote in this research report, that there has been, kind of a progression and regression in terms of democratization that relates to the economic development in the post-Suharto era. Successive presidents after Suharto in 1998 have tried to tackle the problem of inefficient bureaucracies, poor economic performance, have yet to be successful. And all the presidents know full well that poor economic performance might delegitimize democracy. Although, from the literature, we found that we might need to differentiate between democracy and economic development. There are probably two conditions that have to be present, but the causal mechanism yet to be proven. But surprisingly, regardless of the problem of this corruption, collusion, nepotism that resulting in the high cost and efficient economy, surprisingly, Indonesia has been able to maintain 4% economic growth on average since 2005. And also, in addition, the poverty rate has declined to below 10% in 2008 and 2009. Another structural problem that we inherited from the past is that there is this one question that probably is not seen in South Korea, is the relationship between state and religion in the post-authoritarian era. The question of the relationship between state and religion in Indonesia has been there since day one of the republic in 1945, and it continues until today. Simply because, as a matter of fact, Indonesia is a country with, a majority Muslim population, and in the literature there are, wealth of knowledge about the relationship between religion or Islam and democracy. Indonesia has been dubbed as an example where democracy and Islam can actually work together. But it's still that the role of religion in this particular case is Islam is something that the balance has been not found yet in the context of Indonesia. Although at the constitutional level, in the Indonesian constitution maintains that Indonesia is a country that is not based on one particular religion. Now, scholars differ in their view about the complex relationship between Islam and democracy. The general view among scholars is that a certain degree of secularization is a prerequisite of democracy. But, these institutions I mentioned earlier, WF, World Value Survey, Freedom House, the Economic Intelligence Unit, also found that lately, at least in the past 5, probably 10 years, there has been the rise of religious conservatism coupled with populism across the globe, in democracies and in non-democracies, and in mature democracies as well as in new democracies. So the debates about religions and beliefs, how religion and beliefs fit within a democratic political system re-emerge. And then one scholar, for example, argues that the role of religion will be defined by the level of thinness or thickness of a democratic system of one particular country. In a thin democracy, protection of civil life, as mentioned earlier by Professor Howe, protection of civil life and popular suffrage are probably minimum in thin democracy, while in thick democracy, a pluralistic civil society is at work. Now, as a matter of fact, this question of religion is one of the reasons why Indonesia's rating of democracy in the Freedom House surveys and the Economist Intelligence Unit report is one of the reasons why the rating continues to go down. it shows that there is an increasing tension, continuous increasing tension within Indonesian society between the Muslim majority and various minority groups in Indonesia. And it is dealt with by one of the articles, one of the research report that will be discussed tomorrow. But I think the second factor, this is the relationship between state and religion in Indonesia, is one of the factor why we have yet to find a stable consolidation of democracies because of this reason. Maybe the question is not whether religious group fit within the Indonesia's new democratic system, but whether or not conservative groups within Indonesia are solid and can maintain coherence in their conservative agenda. And it seems that, I think, at least up until this research report is written, the religious groups in Indonesia are actually too diverse. And then probably this is the contribution of the moderation of the Indonesian religious society. And then as we've seen in successive elections in Indonesia, religious-based political parties, both the Islamic political parties and in the past we have Christian-based political parties, they are not perform very well in electoral competition. So another question emerged, why these religious-based political parties are not performing very well, and this can be a subject of another research. Now, at the society level, this question about religion and the state is not only about Islam. There are minority groups, Christian groups that also needs to be taken into account, because Indonesia is such a large country. Islam is the majority, but in terms of islands and so on, the eastern part of Indonesia, for example, are predominantly Christian. And then so to see Indonesia as a unitary state that try to democratize itself, we need to take into account various religious groups as well. And then how this minority group strategize in order to cope with the situation where you have majority groups. And then one of the research showed that the minority group has been quite successful in building a strong relationship with large, and this is part of the strategy, with large moderate Islamic groups in Indonesia, namely Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, as well as building coalition with other minority groups, and especially with non-governmental organizations that work in the area of religious freedom and pluralism. So all in all, it contributes to moderation of the Indonesian political system as well as the Indonesian political society. And it creates a network of a civil society organization that contribute to the establishment of the so-called thick democracy that I mentioned earlier. The third factor, as far as the civil society organization is concerned, we agree that the strong civil society is a prerequisite for democracy. And, we examine how various civil society organization or civil society movement or social movement in Indonesia have been progressing since 1998. And then in South Korea, labor unions are strong. But in Indonesia, labor unions and other union groups, for example, farmers and so on, have been struggling to advance their cause and improve their welfare in the post-authoritarian period in Indonesia. So they are not as strong as labor unions in South Korea. So they become some sort of minority group as well. And in the case of labor unions in Indonesia, they tried to form their own political parties and compete in the election, but it did not win any seats in the parliament. Likewise, farmer organizations remain very weak. They are organizationally weak, and so they now face serious problem of sustainability and coherence. But NGOs in Indonesia also strategize in the new setting, new democratic setting. And then in the past, NGO would not want to collaborate with the authoritarian government. out of the fear that they would be co-opted and controlled. But now NGOs are collaborating with policy and lawmakers in various areas in Indonesia with the hope that they could influence, but the results are mixed. Some are successful while the other are not. But one of the reasons why this is the case, the mixed result, is that, you know, in the new democratic setting, there have been an increased acknowledgement and the need from the government side that it should now incorporate public views and concerns in formulating policies. On the NGO side, there has been a decrease in foreign funding availability due to the fact that these international donors now shifted their priorities to other countries that needed more assistance, and they start to consider Indonesia as a new democracy. And then this is quote unquote bad news for the Indonesian NGOs. So now NGOs need to access funding from various state institutions, i.e. taxpayer money in the context of democracy, in order for them to continue their important role of defending public interest vis-a-vis the power holders. And we should not say that this is a bad thing, but I think there's a question that this NGO needs to answer. That is whether or not they can maintain their independence and they can really maintain their role as the defender of public interest with the setting that they are now receive funding from the state institution. So these four areas are areas that are very important in assessing Indonesia's democracy, regardless of the fact that some international agencies consider Indonesia's democracy have been declining in the past few years. But it must be noted that according to various nationwide opinion polls in Indonesia, Indonesians remain faithful to democracy. And I think this is the true modality that as far as people still believe in democracy, then we can continue our democratization process. In a 2019 poll, for example, 82% of the Indonesian respondents believe that democracy is their preferred political system. This is a almost 36% increase from a 2012, 7 years earlier, polls conducted by the same institution. So in conclusion, democratization in Indonesia is a long and difficult process, but from various point of view, I think especially with the public support, Indonesia still has some optimism so that the country would eventually consolidate democracy and probably embark on the same path with South Korea. Thank you. Back to you, Dandi.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Vermonte. So I think we are in the good state of discussions. Since we cover quite broad range of topics, Professor Howe, for example, explains how the economy and democracy interplay in South Korea, and the economic development achievement in the last several decades should be viewed more carefully, for example, more importantly for Indonesia. And also Dr. Vermonte also explains some key factors of Indonesia progress and also regress on democratization. So I will go to the third panelist, Professor Hanah Jan. She's an assistant professor from Graduate School of International Studies, Ewha Women's University. She specializes in the intersection between international business and finance, business ethics, with a focus on socially responsible investing and corporate governance and social responsibility. Professor Jung will discuss her findings on the South Korea's democratic resilience in the time of economic crisis. Professor Jung, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to talk about democratic resilience in Korea in the midst of economic crisis. I'll just be sharing my screen with you. Just give me one moment. I can do this. Okay, so I believe this is the screen over here. It's going to be impossible actually to cover or to give an exhaustive analysis, but I do want to cover some key points for today. So when it comes to when it comes to economic crisis in Korea's modern economic history, the first that actually comes to mind is the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, and that's the picture on your left. This is not just because of the huge economic upheaval at the time, but also concerns that this would have the potential to destabilize the country's relatively new democracy. So more recently, we've also had the pandemic-induced economic disruptions and difficulties. So in other countries, we've seen lockdowns and panic that have led to what others have mentioned to be a noticeable regression or disintegration of democracy from Eastern Europe all the way to Asia. This is mentioned by Dandy and also elaborated upon by Dr. Vermonte as well. So the question we will look at this morning is, despite these periods of economic crisis, how has Korea's democracy remained resilient? So I'm going to cover three major points today. The first is to look at traditional explanations that focus on effective policy response. So while this is important, it may also present an incomplete picture. So then I will also look at some cultural explanations, as well as the lack of viability of alternatives as further reasons for why this might support democratic resilience in Korea. So Professor Howe actually did a great job already talking about the procedurally resilient but still rocky nature of democracy in Korea. So I won't delve too much into the presidents of the Sixth Republic, starting with President Howe. But I do want to point out that the push for greater democratic freedoms really began in earnest around 1960. This was with the April Revolution. After disillusionment with state economic management under President Lee Seung-man, and also revelations of election rigging. So this sentiment was actually summarized very well by a student activist of the day who lamented that neither freedom nor bread was possible under Lee's government, Lee Seung-man. So this led to the toppling of Lee Seung-man's presidency and the election of Chang Myon as Prime Minister of the Second Republic of Korea. But Chang also faced difficulties implementing things like economic reform due to challenging economic conditions. And there was also a split in his party, which meant that he was incapable of reconciling interests from both the left and the right. So after less than 1 year in office, Chang was removed from power in 1961. And of course, as we know, this led to a largely bloodless coup led by Park Chung-hee. I mentioned this to highlight the importance of the state economy nexus in Korea as introduced by Professor Howe, and that the rapid economic development that started under Park Chung-hee supports arguments in the literature that economic development has a genetic effect on democracy, specifically among semi-democracies. So I'll be revisiting the past role of the military on state affairs in a little bit, and how that changed in earnest from President Kim Il-sung's administration. So traditional explanation on why Korea's democracy has been resilient, even through periods of economic crisis, has been that largely, for the most part, policy response under democratic administrations have seemed to be largely effective. This was the case with the Asian financial crisis and to some extent the current COVID-19 pandemic that we are going through right now. It also supports literature that democracy might be more resilient during times of crisis because in a democracy, we can see an exchange of unpopular or ineffective governments without systemic upheaval. So it's able to kind of absorb those movements. In the Asian financial crisis, we also saw high government officials resign, and they were in fact briefly incarcerated for initially mishandling the crisis. And so this would also be consistent with what we see in the academic literature. We also saw President Kim Dae-jung, interestingly, state that the reason behind the crisis in his view was that Korea placed economic development ahead of democracy. So in this way, the narrative was crafted so that democracy was not the root of economic failure, but hopefully would become part of the solution. And for the COVID-19 pandemic as well, similar comments could be made with regards to the policy response in containing the immediate kind of hemorrhaging, and also to make sure that it doesn't have a longer lasting effect on society. On the flip side, and I think Professor Howe was good to mention that there are perhaps the light as well as the darkness as well. But there are a lot of social insecurities and also some paradoxes that we've seen with regards to policy response. And for the Asian financial crisis, a big issue was, of course, at the end of lifetime employment as a result of IMF conditionalities and also broader restructuring strength of corporate governance as well. And so at the time, there was also a need to mitigate risks associated with market-based reforms and create a softer landing. And so this might be something that we would have to think about when it comes to market-based reforms. And also for the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're going through now, although the government was quick to begin with stimulus packages, and in fact, the amount of packages to date, and also in terms of future commitments, have really dwarfed some of the previous amounts, even for previous economic crises in Korea. But there are, of course, concerns on to what extent the government can continue to provide stimulus packages, especially if the pandemic is more longer drawn out than we would hope. And the economy is still largely driven by exports, which means it's very affected by global consumption. And so there are a lot of different variables here at play. Another, and I mentioned paradoxes or maybe ironies of Korea's democracy, is that in some democracies, for example, in the United States, where you have quite a bit of civil disobedience, actually, when it comes to say health guidelines and even mask wearing, as an example, in Korea, the initial success at containing the outbreaks actually relied on a strong level of civil obedience, and there were actually concerns, especially with things like data, personal data, and tracking. With regards to COVID-19 infections, that this was actually in contrast with the promise of more individual freedoms. And more recently, I think a few months ago, Korea's Center for Disease Control and Prevention Director, Cho Kyung, also mentioned that it's true that public interests tend to be emphasized more than human rights of individuals when dealing with these types of infectious diseases. So on the one hand, we did see a greater turnout in the wide-scale elections that took place several months ago in Korea, but at the same time, we have also seen a high level of civil obedience with regards to some of these guidelines, which can be seen as paradoxical. So in addition to traditional explanations of policy response and effective policy response, and if policy response is not effective, then that you can replace them or individuals or even governments more easily in a democratic form of governance, I also took some time to revisit some cultural explanations. For example, that broad group of literature that looks at Confucian tradition versus democratic values, and traditionally, and perhaps as Professor Howe mentioned, maybe the Western liberal democratic form versus Confucian values, where the former emphasizes in the literature individual freedoms, while the latter suggests hierarchy, communitarianism, anti-pluralistic values. Of course, when it comes to lumping Confucianist economies or countries together, that can actually be quite troubling because there are many splinter manifestations of Confucianism as well. And then some elements of so-called Confucian values might also be complementary to democracy, and some have pointed to political accountability, as well as speaking out against injustice. I also alluded to cultural explanations within specifically the context of South Korea when it came to the Asian financial crisis. And so in addition to policy, we had broad movement at the individual level, and others have alluded to a spirit of sacrifice and burden sharing. If you remember the massive gold collection campaigns during the Asian financial crisis that they had raised over, I believe, $2 billion in gold from presidents to the average Joe on the street as well. And we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, even though we have social distancing guidelines, there's still quite high voter turnout, which means active participation in the democratic system. And lastly, just because we're a little strapped on time, I also took a look at alternatives. And so even though Professor Howe mentioned Hell Joseon, and according to some polls, a large number of youth are thinking of leaving the country or have thought of doing so. I haven't seen so much literature on this, but the idea is if, and my kind of curiosity into this was fueled by studies that looked at preference for democracy as opposed to other forms of government. While useful and very helpful in helping to empiricize and quantify perceptions as well as preferences, there hasn't been a lot of further study about what actually is entailed by an alternative. And so what, aside from the theoretical kind of A or B, and so I took a look at some potential alternatives to a democratic form of governance in Korea. The first one I mentioned earlier because of a long, say, military tradition or military influence in state affairs and politics. Some might suggest that perhaps the military will fill this vacuum, and we see that tradition with Park Chung-hee to Chun Doo-hwan, even Roh-tae, the first president of the Sixth Republic, who was a member of Chun Doo-hwan's kind of secret committee. But even as early as Park Chung-hee's administration, it was quite noted that the military was no longer the sole reservoir of talent. This was due to the creation of a new technocratic elite, especially youth, and we had an increasing number of people who had been educated abroad, particularly the United States, and had come back to Korea. So an influx of new ideas and talent as well. And also the role or potential role of military power in politics was further neutralized during Kim Il-sung's administration, so the second president of the Sixth Republic. And one included the purge of officers in the Hanah Jan, which was a private group of military officers led by Chun Doo-hwan that had been instrumental in keeping Chun in power, and also initially with Roh-tae. But there are also additional reforms that further neutralized that potential. So, for example, public figures also had to disclose their assets, and bank accounts under false names were banned. And so a lot of that took place in the 1990s. And then the other, again, because previous studies often pit democracy with authoritarian regimes and preference for one or the other, I think for the case of South Korea, it's very interesting that we have a very close example physically, geographically, of an authoritarian regime, so an alternative next door in the form of North Korea. So in some senses, it's South pitted against North, democracy pitted against authoritarianism. And this feeds back into this idea of state economy, the state economy nexus. But on the economic front, since the 1970s, it was clear that South Korea was on a winning path. Economically, I will show you a few figures. And the North Korean economy was going from bad to worse to even more worse, unfortunately. And so the lack of economic success in North Korea, and also the inability of the government to care for its people and to prioritize securing military power, especially nuclear deterrence, in some ways serves as a living reminder of the potential failures of an authoritarian regime. And so just in contrast, that could be the direction that again, is a very extreme example, but again, closest to South Korea as well. And so I have a couple of tables that just show kind of the turning points. And as Dr. Vermonte was mentioning also before in terms of economic growth. So actually following the Korean War, North Korea on a per capita basis was doing better than South Korea for several years. And then that turning point was during the 1970s, and that accelerated through to today. And so if I had to use two different sets of numbers because unfortunately there wasn't one data source that could show all of the pictures here. But if we look at GDP over here, again, I just took North Korea and South Korea as a proportion. And so from 1990, South Korea's GDP was 12.3 times that of North Korea, and that has just ballooned to over 50 times in 2019. And so whether right or wrong, the idea of South is democracy, North is authoritarianism, and then equating that with economic kind of, in the end, economic output, but also in terms of relative, say, human rights, that I think that there's a mentality, this we can test, but perhaps there's a mentality that, at least in the South, when it comes to democracy, if we pit that against numbers, economic figures, that a democracy is more on a winning path than, for example, authoritarianism in the North, but I'd be happy to discuss that with you as well. And so just to finish up on what I was talking about in terms of effective policy response, clearly this has been helpful in explaining democratic resilience in part. So if the policies work well, that is because, of course, the democratically elected officials did a good job of handling the crisis. Or even in the opposite effect would be that those who were not effective would then be replaced, whether that's individuals or parties, but that worked quite well in the democratic form of governance. But of course, also recognizing things like social insecurity and paradoxes that we've seen. The second one was, although that policy responses might have been effective, it might not present a whole picture of why Korea's democracy is at least procedurally resilient in the midst of economic crisis. So we did look a little bit at cultural explanations as well as so confusion as well as the rallying around the country during the time of the Asian financial crisis with the gold collection campaigns. And then lastly, the lack of viable alternatives or the failure of alternative systems serves as another form of support, perhaps, for democratic resilience in Korea. I did mention that, of course, because it's not an exhaustive piece of research, that there are many things that I would have liked to have looked at but didn't have the opportunity to. Some of that is also involvement in international organizations or even entrenchment with them. For example, the OECD, as mentioned by Professor Howe, and that Korea's involvement was actually crucial to getting out of the Asian financial crisis as quickly as it did. And also because they're dominated by liberal democracies. Again, this can serve as a reinforcing function. And perhaps maybe later in the future, there are elements in Korea of extended legacies, familial, so in the form of, say, chaebols, for example. And so we have some large family-owned, family-managed conglomerates that have been passed on to the second and third generations as well. And so that, again, the love-hate relationship with chaebols and Korean society might also serve as a further deterrent, potentially, of having or some sort of appetite for an extended legacy. And so that's it from me. I would like to end my presentation here, but thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to discussing further.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jan, for the very interesting presentation. Right now, I would like to encourage our participants to join our discussions by using Q&A feature. We will have the discussion session after the panel. So last but not least, I would like to invite Edbert Gani, a researcher from the Department of Political Science and Social Change, CSIS Indonesia. He will explain the relation between the industrialization phenomenon and democratic resilience in Indonesia. For Mr. Edbert Gani, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Dandy. Good morning, everyone, especially for Professor Howe and Professor Jun, and also for Dr. Phillips. Thank you for the opportunity, and let me share my screen first. Okay, so right now I want to present my study that is specifically focusing on the democratic resilience and the industrialization in Indonesia, or maybe in general about the economic development in Indonesia. So as Dr. Phillips has mentioned before, that economic growth and the quality of democracy are often linked as two inseparable things. The theories of democracy itself developed from developed countries that led to the idea that liberal democracy and maybe the capitalist system could be compatible with one another. And especially in a spurring economic growth, like industrialization plays an important role, especially to create a large middle class and to improve the standard of living of the society in general. And it is, of course, the strong middle class that will eventually play an essential role in supporting the democratic politics that everyone strives for. But in Indonesia, the industrialization began in the era of authoritarianism, or maybe before the democracy was reborn in the Reformation era. And Suharto became the president who started the economic development or the industrialization in Indonesia since 1960s. But after the collapse of the Suharto regime and the birth of democracy in 1998, industrialization was weakened. But on the other hand, Indonesia's democracy, after we've been observed for 20 years since the reformation took place in 1998, faced many challenges right now. As Dr. Phillips have mentioned before, indexes from various international institutions place the stagnation on the quality of democracy in Indonesia. And finding the link between economic development and democracy is one of the most debated aspects of political science in general. Many political scientists, as we know, are trying to find the correlation or maybe the associations between democratic indicators with specific economic indicators and try to find the causality between them. But one of the prominent theory is the modernization theory, emerged with the argument that the economic growth will create a mature democracy or even destroy a dictatorship or authoritarianism and give birth to democracy. And with respect to the modernization theory, the works written by Lipset, one of the most prominent political scientists, become many references in comparative political studies. He found a correlation between the sound economic development of a country and the survival of democracy in that country, where high industrialization, urbanization, and education tend to be present in a democratic country. Also, studies related to the relationship between capitalism and democratic systems have developed and maybe divided many economists and political scientists. The polls are divided into those who say that capitalism and democracy are incompatible, while the other polls see the two as mutually beneficial. Jaworski and friends, on the other hand, argue that the modernization theory mostly dominates the indigenous side, in which many countries will transform into a democracy if they reach a certain degree of economic growth. And democracy will eventually be the final state of politics. The problem is that the rise of democracy is not bound to particular economic conditions. The collapse of authoritarian regime globally could occur either within the pace of stable and healthy economic growth, or maybe during a phase of economic crisis. Once democracy has emerged, Jaworski explained in their study, it could only survive if there is a healthy economic growth. And therefore, democracy is not born endogenously, as in the modernization theory said. Instead, it is generated exogenously with certain encouragement and particular complex circumstances. Nevertheless, economic growth still plays a huge determinant role for the sustainability of the democracy system. For Indonesia in particular, the twin crises, namely the economic and political crisis that coincided in 1998, was the primary trigger for the presence of democracy in Indonesia. The same crisis halted the industrialization process initiated by President Suharto before the Reformation era. A centralized political system and a fragile economic foundation were eventually harming the welfare of the community. And thus, the democracy in Indonesia was born exogenously in the society. So, referring to Jaworski and friends, consistent economic growth is good or maybe necessary for building resilience in a democratic system. The more prosperous a society is in a democratic system, the public trust, as Mr. Phillips mentioned before, the public trust that democracy will tend to strengthen. This shows how important economic stability in supporting a democratic political system. An interesting study, I found a study by Mujani and friends in 2018. They gave us an empirical evidence using their original public opinion data in Indonesia that political economy or rational choice best explains the dynamic pattern of change in regime support in Indonesia. As we know in the rational choice approach that Mujani used in their study, elections are described in simple terms as a tool for accountability of authority. Then for that reason, the essential evaluation indicator is the achievement of economic indicators because this is closely related to the individual well-being. This figure that I made from the data from Freedom House and UNDP in 2018 shows that the countries with higher income levels tend to have more established levels of democracy. Indonesia itself follows this trend. The movement of economic growth since the recovery was accompanied by an increase in the level of democracy as observed in the graph. From the figure, it can be seen that Indonesia is currently in the middle position between the level of income and also the level of freedom. Compared with neighboring countries in the Southeast Asian region, Indonesia maybe is the only country that shows the positive development of democracy based on the Freedom Index by the Freedom House. Thailand, for example, has become a country that has experienced a setback from democracy since the Asian financial crisis in 1998. However, the figure also holds concern for the future of our democratic resilience. If, for example, if the rich countries in the upper right corner are removed from the whole graph or from the whole data, we can find no correlation from the GDP per capita and freedom index. The more prosperous the country does not guarantee a higher level of democracy. This shows that there are two main currents in countries in the world to achieve prosperity. Moreover, at that point, Indonesia is currently in the middle of a crossroads. Seen in the figure, the achievements of improving Indonesia's economic prosperity by way of democracy have not been able to surpass the achievements of neighboring countries that take different paths. Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand perhaps currently have higher GDP per capita compared to Indonesia, although all three have levels of democracy far below Indonesia. And now, what about the quality of life of the people in Indonesia? Here, the data presented in this figure shows that there's an increase in the Human Development Index for Indonesia compared to the state in 1998, coupled with democratization. However, just like economic indicators before, the achievement of the increase in the Human Development Index is still far below that of neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore, and is only slightly adrift of the achievements of Vietnam and Philippines. Compared to these countries, Indonesia indeed has better democratic resilience in the 20 years since the Asian financial crisis. Nevertheless, the achievements of democracy cannot yet be translated to accelerate the improvement in people's living standards to the maximum. Countries maybe such as Thailand and Vietnam that do not embrace democracy, for example, can achieve significant increases in Human Development Index with governments that have authoritarian tendencies, as we observe in the scatter plots. The fact that Indonesia is moving slowly improving the quality of life of the people in a democratic era is, for me, in my opinion, is a severe threat to the democratic resilience. By taking the path of democracy, each actor in the country will compare the current situation with the situation in other countries. A democratic system that maybe promise broad political representation does not, unfortunately, always result in a better quality of governance. At the same time, governance is the primary indicator. The quality of governance, for me, is the primary indicator of achieving excellent public services. And in addition, through good governance, maybe the business world can develop healthy, can develop a substantial, healthy businesses due to regulatory certainty. Here, I quote Hill and Siraji, a study that note at least 7 changes in the political economy between the New Order era and the Reformation that had an impact on different patterns of policy formulation. The first is the creation of checks and balances that weaken the power of the president. The second is the cabinet unity was significantly reduced because of the need to accommodate many different groups and interests. Third, the legislative body was significantly more robust than the Suharto era. The fourth is civil society is becoming more energetic and more active. The bureaucracy's role has changed from being only a presidential apparatus to being accountably monitored by the public and parliament. The legal system that has historically not been trusted has turned into an institution with public credibility and trust. Decentralization emerged and divided power and resources from the center to the regions. These 7 changes occurred because of the pressure of democratization during the Asian financial crisis. So the government right now has an interest in driving the Indonesian economy out of lower middle income countries. When faced with progress of non-democratic countries such as China or Vietnam in the last few decades, the country seemingly lost its grips on the superiority of the democratic system to achieve its economic goals, especially with the global economic slowdown and maybe the pandemic, which also contributed to the slowdown in Indonesian economy. And also the power of democracy to guarantee the credibility of political promises has not yet been tested. The current political system creates many disincentives for investment, and most economic reforms are driven more by technocrats within the government who often do not get political supports. So democratic resilience in Indonesia in particular needs support from all parties and components of the society, especially in realizing that democracy is a system that can indeed support excellent public services. An interesting interview for the Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, that I quote here, said that in an authoritarian era, or maybe in the Suharto era, investments were more comfortable to come. For me, this statement is one of the expressions that indicate the frustration at the difficulty of carrying the economic reform, or maybe the market-based economic reform in today's democratic environment. The manufacturing sector, for example, grew significantly at the end of the new order because of export-oriented policies. The driving force were labor incentive industries with large capacities to employ people from the workforce. However, as shown in the graph, since the end of the economic crisis, these industries experienced a decline and contributed very little to Indonesia's total exports. The decline, as seen in the figure, affected workforce growth in the manufacturing sector with a performance below the agricultural and services industry. And according to our senior economist at CSIS, Pak Aswi Cahyono, employment growth from the manufacturing industry in the period after the Reformation era was significantly lower than in the Suharto era. The low percentage was caused by a decline in the labor incentive industrial sector, such as the textile and the footwear industry, while capital incentive sectors grew significantly during the same period. The lack of business orientations focusing on the manufacturing sector is also reflected in Indonesia's wealthiest people. So I created a data set using the data from the Forbes, the ranking published by the Forbes, that the 10 most affluent people in Indonesia in 20 years post-Reformation era have not experienced a significant change, especially in terms of the industries they represent, like tobacco, real estate, mining, and banking corporations dominate the list of sectors controlled by the wealthy. Even the conglomerates who have remained on the list since the New Order era have remained within the same industries. And the newest trend may be just the rise of conglomerates in the media industry. Economic policy reform and implementation often cannot run smoothly in Indonesia because each political party and politician is more interested in meeting short-term incentives rather than investing in the more long-term plan. Economic reform policies are driven more by technocrats within the bureaucracy who deal with economic matters. With a large number of coalition parties to form a government, several strategic ministries are often given to politicians as coalition seats. The interests of political parties then enter into the decision-making process of each ministry and have the potential to hamper the technocratic reforms that the state is trying to do. Since the Reformation era, we observe that the composition of entrepreneurs in political parties has received considerable attention from the public. But interestingly, the composition of entrepreneurs is at the top of political parties and at the regional level. CSIS conducted an allied census in 2015 to 4 major political parties in Indonesia. And the interviews were conducted with around maybe 2,000 party leaders at the national, provincial, and the district level. And the result was interesting because it showed that 50% of the heads of these parties have entrepreneurial backgrounds or they are businessmen in general. This figure is so dominant compared to other backgrounds such as NGOs, activists, or maybe academics. And the problem is the financing of political parties that require significant capital is not yet supported by the funding from the public. The CSIS also note that the average operational costs incurred by political parties only for operational costs for 4 billion a month. Therefore, political parties in Indonesia are still very dependent on the financial capital owned by educators. Hence, those who can compete in political parties are those who have vast material resources, and the party also benefited from this condition to be able to survive. The large number of entrepreneurs entering the political sphere has a significant impact, in our opinion, on the difficulty of carrying out economic reforms to support market-based or maybe to support industrialization. The rent-seeking trend, as Dr. Phillips mentioned before, which was a problem in the Suharto era, unfortunately continue in the Reformation era. Many business actors use populist narratives for a nationalist economy that is anti-international trade. And the state itself was eventually forced to continue to adapt to this populist nationalist economy. Even until now, the current Jokowi government perpetuate this condition. Even entrepreneurs involved in political parties don't have maybe an orientation to the manufacturing industry, so this aspect does not get a meaningful political impetus. In addition, the trade union pressure always exists outside the parliament and often uses each other with political parties. The impact is the development of the ease of Indonesian businesses, which can be said slow in the progress in the current era, although maybe improvement still need to be appreciated in this era. More importantly is the long-term effect on the well-being of small communities themselves. And to conclude, the stagnation being faced by Indonesia cannot be separated from the institutional design chosen since entering the Reformation. Political institutions affect not only ongoing democracy, but also affect economic reforms that need to go on. At the same time, belief in the democratic system itself is challenged with when the economy cannot thrive. That's all I want to present. Thank you. Back to you, Dandi.
Okay, thank you very much, Gani, for the presentation. Now we will go to the question and answer session. We already have several questions. I think the first one will be for all the panelists. So this is a question from Puji Astuti from Ministry of Defense from Indonesia. The question is, what are the key difference features between Indonesia and South Korea democracy? Maybe Professor Howe can answer it first.
Actually, I see the other question there about corruption is directly targeted at.
Oh yeah. If you want to answer that question as well, it will be
sure.
fine. Yeah,
I think that's probably the best way. So if I deal with them first of all in terms of how did Korea deal with corruption, and then comparing the differences between the Republic of Korea and the Republic of Indonesia. So Korea tackling corruption. Actually, Korea doesn't have the best record for tackling corruption. It consistently ranks as the most corrupt developed democracy. So, okay, there are other developed countries that are more corrupt and there are other democracies that are more corrupt, but for a developed democracy, Korea doesn't do so well, at least historically has not done so well. And it's been very difficult to tackle corruption in Korea because of the elite capture of all the commanding heights of governance, but also the overlap between them. I mean, it's been called a chaebol republic, that the business conglomerates are also hand in hand with the political elites, and they're also hand in hand historically with the military elites. So it's been very problematic to hold people to account, whether they be business leaders or political leaders. Even when you do arrest them and convict them, very often, if not always, they end up getting pardoned when their friends get back into power. In fact, it got so bad, I would say, under the Park Geun-hye administration that this may have been necessary as a turning point. Things had to get bad enough that people say enough is enough. And they overthrew the Park administration with mass demonstrations in the streets, and particularly because of the corruption. And so this gave the incoming administration a much stronger hand to deal with the corruption, to deal with the overlapping influence. And indeed, they managed to imprison the two former presidents. And even though they appealed these decisions, they've actually lost their appeals and their sentences were increased. So it looks as if finally this is being dealt with, but only because things were allowed to get bad enough. Also, there's a question there about the local politics. Local politics actually dominates the voting patterns in Korea. Your decision as to which party you vote for is based on which region you live in, mostly. But again, this was to a certain extent broken in the most recent elections because of the overwhelming support for a revisionist mandate. This leads on to the second question, the differences between Korea and Indonesia. Korea has always had a very centralized power, partly because of the concern about the regions. But also Korea has been dominated by the chaebol, politically and economically. So we had a chaebol republic even when we had the military in power. So I think this is probably historically the big difference, that in Indonesia, you had khaki capitalism. The army was in charge of the commanding heights of political governance, but also economic governance. Whereas in Korea, it was the chaebol that were controlling everything, the business conglomerates. And this has continued to a lesser extent since democratization. The chaebol are still incredibly influential in politics in Korea, whereas in Indonesia, I think you've had a significant retreat from politics and economics by the army. I don't know, I'll leave it to my fellow panelists to discuss how far that's actually gone and what's taken its place in Indonesian democracy.
Thank you very much, Professor Howe. I would like to give the screen to Dr. Vermonte.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting questions and also interesting response from Professor Howe. And I'm particularly interested in following up the point that made by Professor Howe in responding to the question, that is the centralized government of South Korea. That is something now in Indonesia is probably undermined because of the decision back in 1998, 1999 to decentralize power to more than 500 districts and cities and 34 provinces. So now we are, akin to actually federal state, with different name, because essentially powers have been devolved into the regions in Indonesia. And also a second point that Professor Howe made is the reason why probably South Korea has this centralized nature of power because of the regional concern. And probably it is because of competition with China, with Japan, historically, always vulnerable. And now with North Korea, with as a nuclear power, so that, essentially it is some kind of a systemic vulnerability that country like South Korea always try to have a solid and centralized power in order to respond to any possible, challenges from this power surrounding South Korea, systemic vulnerability. It happens as well to Taiwan. Taiwan has systemic vulnerability against China, and then some other countries, Singapore, for example, surrounded a small country surrounded by big countries with different culture, different political system, different religion. So they become more solid and unified, and then become a more effective and efficient government. Now, that Indonesia probably does not have systemic vulnerability against something else, or maybe in the layman term, no common enemy. But I do have a belief that Indonesia actually has a systemic vulnerability of its own, that is natural disasters. It costs us economically, socially, and then when disasters happen in Indonesia, we press the reset button. Development stop. We have to rebuild. Allocate budget. It's kind of vicious circles. So we are not going far in terms of development, because once a big disaster occurs, then we have to reinvest. Rebuild. And do things that we actually can do. If we don't have that kind of disasters, we can invest more on other things, technologies and so on. So that's the second, I think, difference between South Korea and Indonesia. But in general term, we do have our own systemic vulnerability that actually should give some focus on for our policymakers, to prioritize. Thirdly, I think, I don't know whether this is in terms of analytical framework. I'm not really a big fan of cultural factor in explaining political system, because it seems that kind of a residual when we don't have other explanations, then we say that well, the culture is different. But I do think maybe I'm not an expert on South Korea, but given the fact that Indonesia is more diverse in terms of culture, in terms of religion, ethnicity, even languages, and so on. So it requires a different set of political system. And right now, for example, in terms of election system, we adopt the proportional representation system that, according to many studies, PR system is more correlated with the level of corruption. Countries that adopt PR system are more vulnerable to corruption, simply because it increases the cost of election. For example, as asked by Fitri, increase money politics because it places representation more than governance. Governability, then the election system become too complex, and if something is too complex, then it creates a loopholes for so many things, corruption, collusion, and how power is organized in Indonesia. That's probably my response, just to add, and to agree with Professor Howe.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vermonte. So I would like to ask Professor Jan to give your 2 cents.
I might just have 1 cent because this is how Dr. Vermonte did a great job of expounding. I would like to, I guess this might be another time to expand upon what's already been mentioned in terms of money politics, corruption, and also, again, the poignant point that on paper, again, procedurally resilient, but in fact very rocky and quite tenuous in South Korea. And because of all of these legacies, I think that have existed and continue today. So remnants of things like strong state and strong chaebol. And that, as also Dr. Vermonte mentioned, because South Korea geopolitically is surrounded by great powers all around, but has managed economically to be quite formidable in its own right. But that lack of, for example, nuclear deterrent, as the North has, that it's quite challenging in many respects. I think because we have also the one-term 5-year presidential administration. Again, part of that was to counter the potential for a much more extended presidential administration, and perhaps dangers of hearkening back to the past, where you have one person essentially in charge for an extended period of time. But at the same time, what Professor Howe was mentioning in terms of corruption, it really happens on both sides, regardless of, I don't think there's a person or party really who has a monopoly on morality. I'm sure that there would be evidence on both sides, but I found that the danger is, and I mentioned a little bit in my manuscript, but it feels more retaliatory when you have a switch in administration, that it's now time to right past wrongs. And again, this happens on both sides. And so you've had the presidential curse, of course. And so of those who are still alive have all been, with the exception of the current one, accused in some form or another. And so it's still quite contentious, but and the data is quite mixed in terms of preference as well. But at least with money, there have been some steps to try to curb say money going back and forth. It's nowhere near probably necessary. For example, anti-graft legislation that was introduced, but largely perhaps outside of the realm of lawmakers, unfortunately, but limiting in terms of monetary value, what can be given in terms of gifts and also meals. And in some sense, it's, I don't want to say it's an embarrassment, because it's essentially saying that money going back and forth is problematic, and we need to curb this and to make sure that power relations aren't fed by money under the table. But again, it's just a start, and something that I think is much more systemic that would need to be addressed.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I would like to invite Gani to answer the question.
I think I just want to add a simple additional argument for the question. I think Indonesia has been enjoying the legacy of the economic growth itself because we've been observing the growth of the middle class in Indonesia, and the emergence of the generation of middle class with the political literacy cannot be separated from the development of the economy. And for example, the September 2019 demonstration last year, it's clearly showed that students from various economic levels ventured to demonstrate together, and most of them naturally came from the middle class. And the access to information that has developed considerably in the 2000 years of democratization and the level of education was the fruit of the economic growth during the Reformation. So despite the challenges, one particular example of the democratization in Indonesia is the interesting trend of the social movement that keep growing from year to years. And the massive demonstrations in the past years became signs of a robust political preferences among the younger voter, or maybe the younger generation of civil liberties or so on. And maybe the protest itself was protest because it was considered to be able to deprive civil liberties, which included like maybe protection of women and the victims of sexual violences, freedom to criticize the authorities, and many more, right? In contrast to the maybe the 1998 generation, which was primarily motivated by the economic failure, the action in 2019, maybe 2020, this year, were more related to the struggle for democratic values that have taken root in the community. So anti-corruption awareness, for example, maybe it's also increasingly socialized in this generation, or maybe the millennials, or maybe the Generation Z, together. And these thousands of students can considerably important in the making of maybe the more resilience of democracy in Indonesia. And I think the trend is on the track. If we compare with the other major democracy around the world, that social movement and energetic civil society are important to prevent the setback of democracy. I think that's a simple additional argument from me.
Okay, thank you very much, Gani, for your explanation. So unfortunately, we have to conclude the session due to limited time. Thank you very much for all panelists, Professor Howe, Professor June, Dr. Vermonte, and Gani for the very enlightening discussion. And I very much look forward to the final work of this project, and also everybody else. Also, I would like to say thanks to all participants that are joining us today's webinar. I think there will be one more webinar for tomorrow about state society and democratization in Indonesia and the Republic of Korea. So we are still looking forward to see all the participants for tomorrow webinar. I think that's it for me for today webinar, and have a good day. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dandy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Howe, Professor Jun.
Thank you.
Stay healthy. Take care.